Like it or not, gaming has its own Mount Rushmore for the greatest liars. I'm talking about developers who looked straight into a camera, sold impossible dreams with a straight face, and then shipped something else entirely.
Is the game world infinite?
Yeah.
Does the game world make BioShock Infinite look less infinite by comparison?
Yes.
Now, lying in gaming isn't rare. Almost every studio has oversold a feature, cut content, or quietly pretended a trailer never existed.
What the hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
What the hell are you doing here?
I think I'd let you do this on your own.
That's normal. That's business. But Mount Rushmore isn't for normal lies. This mountain is reserved for a very specific type of offender. So to keep this fair, and to avoid pure nostalgia rage, I'm using a 4-point test. First, there has to be a clear promise. A real, on-record statement or demo. Secondly, that promise has to be ignored or blatantly contradicted at launch. No technicalities, no, you misunderstood. They just have to have given people the middle finger at launch and told the buyers to do their worst. Third, the fallout cannot cost them real power. In fact, for some of them, they got a promotion. And finally, knowing players have no real leverage, they repeat the pattern anyway. Pass all four, and congratulations, you might deserve to be carved into gaming's Mount Rushmore of lies. And fair warning, one face on this mountain is pretty obvious. Let's begin. Cyberpunk 2077, CD Projekt Red. Cyberpunk 2077 is what happens when marketing stops being a preview and starts being a promise. When CD Projekt Red announced and released Cyberpunk, they didn't frame it as a work in progress or an ambitious experiment. They told people the game was finished, complete, ready.
You see all these interesting characters walking around, and you can interact with a lot of those guys. And some of them might offer you quests, some might offer you something smaller, but we want to make sure that everywhere you go, there's something interesting to see, something interesting to do.
Most players believed they were about to get a genre-redefining open-world RPG that would run properly on current consoles. During pre-release, the marketing focused almost entirely on high-end PC footage. What people saw was a vibrant, living city with advanced AI systems, dense crowds, and reactive environments. Night City looked alive. It looked next-gen before next-gen even existed. But that created a concern. The demos were clearly running on powerful PCs, and people started asking the obvious question: how is this going to run on regular hardware, on consoles, on lower-end PCs? On the systems most people actually owned? CD Projekt Red tried to calm that fear. One of their developers went on record and said the game ran surprisingly well. He went even further, saying they were treating consoles as first-class platforms and that the game looks amazing there. So when launch day came, people didn't feel reckless spending $60. They felt justified. You know, when they warned that the demo walkthrough didn't represent the final look of the game, they weren't lying. Just not in the way anyone expected.
Now, I could paint the sidewalk with your guts, but that wouldn't get me what I'm owed. Oh, you want to try? Go on, son. Save me!
The final product was embarrassing. The game was a catastrophe. Bugs everywhere, constant crashes, severe pop-in, textures melting in real time, frame rates collapsing under their own weight. And when you did see people, it was terrifying. NPCs T-posing, characters snapping in and out of existence, cars literally falling from the sky. At one point, it was raining vehicles. Eventually, Sony had no choice but to pull Cyberpunk 2077 from the PlayStation Store, which is basically the industry equivalent of having your album yanked off streaming because it's unlistenable. Refund requests flooded in so fast that CD Projekt Red had to publicly apologize for how broken the game was.
And despite good reviews on PC, the console version of Cyberpunk 2077 did not meet the quality standard we wanted it to meet. I and the entire leadership team are deeply sorry for this, and this video is me publicly owning up to that.
Now, let's apply the Mount Rushmore test. Criterion 1. Was there a clear promise? Absolutely. Criterion 2. Did the launch contradict that promise? Completely. Criterion 3. Did the fallout cost power and credibility? Yes, in a very real, measurable way. Criterion 4. Was this a repeating identity, a sustained pattern that became their brand? Not really. This wasn't a lifelong calling card. It was a disaster. Verdict. Cyberpunk doesn't make Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore is for the ones who pull this off and still walk away untouchable. CD Projekt Red didn't. No Man's Sky. Unlike Cyberpunk, which clearly aimed high but failed to deliver across all platforms, No Man's Sky didn't miss the mark. It blatantly lied about the product on record.
Is the game world infinite?
Yeah.
Does the game world make BioShock Infinite look less infinite by comparison?
Yes.
They promised an infinite universe, 18 quintillion planets, ecosystems so vast you'd never see the same thing twice, multiplayer so organic you might just stumble into another player one day, like fate itself decided to cross your paths. And Sony helped amplify that vision. They put this tiny studio on a massive stage and let imagination do most of the marketing. And imagination filled in the gaps. At launch, the universe technically existed, but the experience players were sold did not. Yes, the game had an enormous number of planets, but the gameplay itself was shallow and repetitive. Planets blurred together, systems repeated, exploration quickly felt hollow, and most notably, multiplayer simply wasn't there. Despite repeated assurances that players might encounter each other, it was impossible to see or interact with another player at launch. Two players famously coordinated to meet on the same planet and couldn't see each other. Other promised elements were missing or severely downgraded. Large-scale factions, orbital battles, living NPC civilizations. Even the visual variety shown in trailers didn't make it into the final game. Lush landscapes were flattened. Iconic creatures like the sandworms were either missing or barely present. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Steam reviews tanked to overwhelmingly negative. Players accused Sean Murray of deceptive marketing. At one point, the UK's Advertising Standards Authority got involved. And then Sean Murray disappeared. No interviews, no explanations, no damage control. Just silence. But here's where No Man's Sky breaks from the others. To their credit, Hello Games didn't keep selling the lie. They stopped selling entirely. Instead, they went quiet and worked. For years. Pushing out massive, free updates that slowly rebuilt the game people thought they were buying back in 2016. Multiplayer was added, base building, deeper systems, more variety, more structure. Over time, No Man's Sky became something much closer to the vision that had originally been promised. So let's apply the criteria. Was there a clear promise? Yes. Was it contradicted at launch? Absolutely. Did the fallout remove power and credibility? Completely. At first. Did the deception become a sustained identity? No. Sean Murray paid for it. Publicly. Repeatedly. So our verdict? No Man's Sky does not stay on the mountain. Aliens, colonial marines. At least with Cyberpunk, the developers warned players that what they were seeing might change. CD Projekt Red repeatedly said their demos were still in flux. Aliens, colonial marines did the opposite. What Gearbox showed was presented explicitly as real gameplay. In demos shown to press and fans, the game featured cinematic lighting, tense corridors, and xenomorphs that hunted players intelligently. Flanking, retreating, coordinating. The AI appeared reactive and dangerous, behaving less like scripted enemies and more like living predators. Everything about those demonstrations suggested a faithful, high-end adaptation of the alien universe, and people believed it. Then the game launched. What players received barely resembled what had been shown. The lighting was flatter, the environments were stripped down, entire set pieces from the demos were missing or heavily altered. But the most damning failure was the enemy AI. The xenomorphs, the core of the experience, were broken. Enemies ran in circles. They ignored players. They failed to react to gunfire. In some cases, they stood still, behaving like unfinished test dummies rather than apex hunters. Side-by-side comparisons between promotional footage and retail gameplay spread quickly, and the difference was undeniable. This wasn't optimization loss or last-minute trimming. It was a fundamentally different product. Press outlets began asking uncomfortable questions. Fans accused Gearbox of bait-and-switch marketing. Investigations later revealed that development resources had been diverted away from Colonial Marines to other projects, while the demo footage continued to be used as a selling tool. And yet, this is where Aliens Colonial Marines separates itself from the others. Gearbox Software did not lose relevance. Randy Pitchford did not disappear. The studio continued releasing successful titles. Its leadership retained industry influence. There was backlash, but it didn't result in lasting consequences. The promises were clear. The launch directly contradicted them. And crucially, the fallout did not cost the people responsible their power. That's the final test. Aliens Colonial Marines wasn't a one-time accident that destroyed credibility. It became a defining stain that didn't end careers. The deception didn't collapse under scrutiny, it survived it. And that's why this one qualifies. This is our first carved face on the mountain. Watch Dogs. Watch Dogs was Ubisoft's future. At least, that's how it was sold. The 2012 E3 demo was era-defining. Rain-soaked streets, dense crowds, lighting that screamed next-gen. The game looked alive in a way open worlds hadn't before. What Ubisoft didn't say was that this wasn't how the final game would look. They let the footage speak for them, and people listened. When Watch Dogs finally launched, the difference was impossible to ignore. Lighting effects were reduced, textures were softened, weather systems were scaled back. The city still functioned, but it no longer impressed. Side-by-side comparisons spread fast, and the word downgrade became inseparable from the game's name. The backlash was loud, but controlled. Ubisoft denied intent. Later, they admitted lessons were learned. The game still sold well. Sequels followed. The company survived with minimal scars. Now, apply the Mount Rushmore test. Clear promise? Yes, visually, unmistakably. Contradicted at launch? Yes. Did the fallout cost power? Not really. Did this become a repeating identity? No. Ubisoft adjusted. The downgrade scandal became a cautionary tale, not a business model. Watch Dogs didn't turn misleading marketing into a brand. It became a mistake Ubisoft tried not to repeat publicly. The War Z. The War Z wasn't marketed with cinematic trailers or grand interviews. It did something simpler, and arguably worse. It lied on the store page. When the War Z hit Steam Early Access in 2012, its description promised multiple massive maps, 100-player servers, deep skill systems, and private servers. These weren't framed as future goals. They were presented as features players were buying right now. What players actually loaded into was barely a skeleton. There was one map, half the promised player count, no skill system, no private servers. Systems listed as selling points simply didn't exist. It was false inventory, plain and simple. And you know how the internet handles that. Side-by-side comparisons of what was advertised versus what was playable spread fast. Within days, Valve took the rare step of pulling the game from the store entirely and issuing refunds. That alone tells you how severe the misrepresentation was. Then came the apology, or whatever passed for one. The developer blamed players for misreading the store page, arguing that the descriptions were open to interpretation. That response didn't just pour fuel on the fire. It confirmed that the deception wasn't accidental. It was defensive. But this is where the War Z fails the Mount Rushmore test. After the fallout, there was nothing left. The studio lost credibility instantly. The game was rebranded, but the stain never faded. No influence survived. No authority remained. The people behind it didn't keep selling confidence. They lost the ability to sell anything at all. SimCity. So before we go any further, I'm just going to carve EA into Mount Rushmore right now. It's EA. No one can tell me otherwise. EA and Maxis's 2013 SimCity reboot was marketed with bold claims about a revolutionary simulation engine called Glassbox and a vision of a deeply connected, always-online city-building experience. In the lead-up to release, Maxis developers promised that every individual sim in a city had their own life, driving an unprecedented level of detail in how cities were simulated. They showed off features like intricate agent-based traffic systems, personalized citizens, and regional gameplay where multiple cities interacted with each other, all supposedly calculated together through cloud servers. And this part mattered. EA insisted SimCity had to be online because the simulation was so advanced that parts of it needed to be processed on their servers. The always-online requirement wasn't framed as DRM. It was framed as a feature. That messaging led players to believe this SimCity was technically groundbreaking, so advanced that offline play simply wasn't possible. A limitation was sold as proof of ambition, and that framing mattered because it turned a restriction into a selling point. Then the game launched, and players couldn't play it at all. The always-online requirement immediately backfired when EA's servers collapsed under load. For days, thousands of people who had paid for the game couldn't even log in to play single-player. And when players did finally get in, the simulation didn't match the rhetoric. Sims didn't live full lives. Traffic AI collapsed into chaos. Cities were smaller, shallower, and more constrained than previous entries in the series. It didn't take long for the real story to come out. Modders, and eventually developers, discovered the game ran perfectly fine offline. The online component wasn't about computational necessity. It was about control. Later, Maxis quietly added an offline mode themselves, confirming what players already knew. The cloud necessity was never necessary. The backlash was enormous. EA, already the industry's favorite villain, leaned fully into the role. Free games were handed out as apologies. Consumer trust cratered. And within a few years, Maxis's main studio was shut down entirely. No criteria needed. Let's move on. Goddess. Goddess was introduced by famed designer Peter Molyneux as a spiritual successor to Populous. In his own words, the ultimate God game. It launched on Kickstarter in late 2012 with an ambitious pitch, an innovative reinvention of the God game genre. A living, breathing world shaped by the player. Persistent multiplayer that would allow thousands of gods to interact. Cross-platform play between PC and mobile. And a long list of other sweeping ideas. Molyneux's studio, 22 Cans, didn't just promise big concepts, they promised specifics. A large-scale cooperative and competitive multiplayer realm called the Hub World, a documentary, an art book, direct community involvement, even a God of Gods contest winner who would supposedly influence the game itself. Combined with Molyneux's pedigree, all of this built enormous expectations. Backers believed Goddess wouldn't just be a game, it would be a community-driven experiment, shaped over time by the people funding it. What released was unfinished, shallow, and fragmented. Despite raising around £526,000, roughly $800,000, on Kickstarter, Goddess failed to deliver on many of its core promises. The game entered early access on PC in 2013, then launched on mobile in 2014. But the PC version stalled without key features, while development priority quietly shifted to mobile, which turned out to be a simplified, microtransaction-heavy experience. Crucially, the centerpiece feature never arrived. The promised multiplayer didn't exist. Years later, there was still no persistent hub world, no meaningful shared God experience. The Linux version never materialized either. Even the single-player systems fell short. Instead of a rich, evolving world, the PC version felt thin and incomplete. Mechanics were repetitive. Progression was grindy. The living world concept existed more in interviews than in the game itself. As development dragged on, 22 Cans focused almost entirely on mobile, effectively dumbing down the experience, despite early assurances that the PC version wouldn't be compromised. Communication with backers became sporadic. Promised rewards like the behind-the-scenes book went undelivered. The God of Gods contest winner later admitted he received none of what was promised. Eventually, even members of 22 Cans acknowledged the truth. The project failed to meet the promises and impressions that had gotten it funded. The backlash was personal. Interviews turned hostile. Backers felt betrayed. The disappointment wasn't abstract. It had names attached to it. And in the end, Peter Molyneux retreated from the public eye almost entirely. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. Goddess feels like Mount Rushmore material, right up until you apply Criterion 3. Peter Molyneux didn't survive this. His influence collapsed. His reputation finally caught up with him. And honestly, that's the bummer part. I played this on mobile years ago and genuinely wanted to experience what the PC version was supposed to be. Now, I know you guessed. Neil Druckmann is often labeled a liar, not because he invented a fake game, but because of how expectations around The Last of Us Part 2 were managed. In the lead-up to release, Druckmann publicly framed the sequel as a story about hate, consequences, and moral ambiguity. That framing wasn't false, but it was selective. Marketing materials, trailers, and interviews were constructed in a way that strongly implied Joel would play a significant role throughout the game. One trailer even digitally altered scenes to replace another character with Joel, presenting a version of the story that never actually existed. So when the game launched and Joel was killed early, many players didn't feel shocked. They felt misled. After release, Druckmann repeatedly denied that the marketing was deceptive, arguing instead that it was honest misdirection. That response hardened the backlash. For critics, the problem wasn't the story decision itself. It was the refusal to acknowledge that the audience had been deliberately guided toward false assumptions, then told their reaction was wrong. Over time, Druckmann's public posture shifted. He stopped speaking like a creator defending a narrative choice and started speaking like a moral authority, framing criticism as bad faith rather than disagreement. That widening gap between what was implied before release and what players received is why detractors call it a lie, even though the game itself was technically complete, polished, and fully functional. This wasn't about broken systems or missing features. It was about expectation management, and about being told, after the fact, that you were never supposed to believe what you were shown.
Are there going to be more trees in the Elder Scrolls 6 than Skyrim, or less?
Are there going to be more trees in Elder Scrolls 6 or less? More. Most definitely more.
Todd Howard's reputation comes from a different pattern. As the public face of Bethesda, Howard has repeatedly made confident, sweeping claims that later collapsed under scrutiny. Fallout 76 was described as a polished multiplayer experience built around player freedom and strong systems. It launched broken, unstable, and missing core features. Across the Elder Scrolls and Fallout releases, the language stayed familiar. Games were called fully playable, next-gen, or working surprisingly well, only for players to run headfirst into bugs so persistent they became memes. Not edge cases, not rare issues, core experiences. Howard's most infamous trait is optimism presented as certainty. Phrases like, "it just works," didn't become symbolic because they were jokes. They became symbolic because they were said sincerely, even when reality contradicted them. That sincerity is important. It's not deception delivered with malice. It's confidence delivered without restraint. Unlike Druckmann, Howard rarely reframes criticism as a moral failing. He doesn't argue that players misunderstood art or intent. Instead, he minimizes. He reframes failed launches as learning experiences. He acknowledges issues just enough to move past them, and then moves on without real accountability. To critics, that consistency isn't reassurance. It's proof that exaggeration has no consequences. I will not be adding Todd to this list, but do you think he should be our fourth head on the wall? Let me know in the comments.